Welcome to another episode of Silmarillion Sessions. I'm Dr. Mikael Thompson, and this is my co-host, Mr. Lasseter. And we are going to continue our discussion on the Silmarillion, Chapter 3, the coming of the elves, the awakening of the elves, which is actually an interesting thing. As I realized, I said that wrong at the beginning. The coming of the elves, it's the awakening of the elves, and we get to human beings. Man, it'd be the coming of the men into the West. We've already seen the dwarves. And so we're introduced at this point, conceptually, in our conversation here, we've got dwarves who are created by Aule and then put back to sleep because they can't be awake first. It's the elves and human beings that need to awaken first. They need to somehow come into the world first. The elves awaken first. Then you've got elves then and man, that is human beings. So you've got dwarves, elves, and men as far as the sort of physical embodied creatures. We already know about the Valar and the Maiar and other similar sorts of spiritual entities, spiritual beings that are roaming about the cosmos. And that, I think, brings up, as I mentioned at the beginning of the previous episode, that we've kind of got two themes that we wanted to discuss for this chapter. Last chapter, we discussed the nature of the Silmarillion as a work. What kind of literature is it? Why the highfalutin language? How do we understand that? What's the effect that has? What's the importance of words? And what are some of the key conflicts and themes that we'll want to be paying attention to? If you missed out on that, check out those from the previous episode. And also the second theme is the question of race, because this is something that has, ever since really the original publication of Lord of the Rings, been a critique that has been leveled from small, minority voice quarters. I don't mean minority like ethnic or racial minority, but intellectual academia minority. Criticism of Tolkien being anything from a full-blown Nazi-loving racist to racialist undertones, to just really hating Cockney people because that's how the trolls talk, to the whole gamut of these kinds of things. And that the popularity of that kind of critique against Tolkien and the works of Tolkien has grown and fallen, grown again in different times and places. One of them famously actually is a lot of activity in Italy, largely from the Italian political left elite. Really spurred a lot by an early translation into Italian of Tolkien's works, which actually we know really played fast and loose with some of the terms, and I think led to things being, as Umberto Eco says, over-interpreted. That is, reading some of your own stuff into there, or mistaking certain signs and symbols to mean something meaningful in one context is not meaningful in another, and they're misinterpreted. But there is the question. Even if you read Tolkien in his original language, that is English, well, in its original translation into English from the High Elvish that he conceived it in the deeps of time. Because just as a tangent, the guy was like really a nerd. I mean, as a philology professor, as a fellow philology professor, this is a fellow who wanted to write a backstory to Beowulf, like what was the original version, and so he went ahead and wrote it in Old English, like old proto Old Anglo-Saxon Scandinavian language, and then translated that into English so it would have the right feel when you had it in English, in modern English. So this is he did stuff like this. We do stuff like that. That's welcome to the world of philology, kids. Looking for a career, this might be your calling. But the question of race, I think, is an interesting one, because we are accustomed to talking about, and even Tolkien talks about in the text, we have mention of these different races of Middle Earth. But of course, when that translates into the modern parlance of our times, we also tend to use, and I personally feel very unfortunately, we use that same term race to refer to different groups of human beings as though they were different races, because there's a whole history of racialist theory behind that. And when those two come together, then there's room for a lot of possibly definitely creative, sometimes fruitful, mostly damaging reinterpretation of what Tolkien is doing, what his whole project is. So that's what we wanted to tackle today. I figure it's an apt opportunity to do so, because we have the awakening of the elves. And not only that, but Forte, so kind of one direction to go with this is that we have the awakening of the elves, but then we're told about the different races of the elves. Mm-hmm. And so how do we square with some of that? And I would say that that is a piece of evidence contrary to the dominant the narrative of the dominant narrative of the criticism of Tolkien, the critical theory approach to Tolkien, that imputes a certain racism, or the most benign level of kind of racialism in Tolkien. I wanted to kick it off first. Let's clarify some terms, and I want to give a definition of those two ideas, racialism and racism, and then hand it over to you, Will, to talk, because we've mentioned before, actually, you put forward the idea about how do we understand the dwarves in The Hobbit when we were discussing that. So first term, racialism. We could define that as the idea that human beings can be subdivided into categories with fixed physical, and I would add also psychological, spiritual characteristics of whatever nature, primarily tend to be categorized by some sort of physical characteristic. And then, at least in the history of racialist ideologies, they tend to impute certain spiritual, moral, psychological characteristics to what they identify as these different races. So that's racialism. Then there's racism, which is the idea that those categories of the different races should be ranked in some sort of hierarchical way. Some races are better than others. That's racism. So difference between racialism and racism. Racism says some races are better than others. Some racist ideologies say one particular race of its particular variety of this race is superior to all the others. That's the one we're most familiar with. But in general, the idea that these races should be ranked in a hierarchical way is what is properly meant by racism. And racialism is simply the idea that human beings are subdivided into these categories that are called races. Plain and simple, whether or not there's a hierarchy, but they've got fixed deterministic traits, something like that. Now, but I want to point out, first off, because everybody should be aware, before we impose our immediate postmodern 21st century understandings of what some of those different races are, is that those boundaries have not been fixed throughout all of history. And in the history of racialist ideologies and thought, that what they define as different races has changed drastically over time. So it may not fit the categories that the modern American listener might be thinking when they hear the word race, and who counts as what race or another. But I want to bring that back into Tolkien and say, okay, so we've got elves, so we've got dwarves. Those are two different races in Middle Earth. Is that equivalent to different races in our day and age in this same Middle Earth? Because of course the low-hanging fruit that people will attack within Tolkien and say, clearly elves are the pure Aryan Nordic type, according to Nazi, all of the Nazis, tall, blonde, fair, etc. And dwarves are clearly Jews. What do you have to say to that?
Oh, nothing. What is it? Silence construes consent or whatever.
Right.
Okay. How to go about answering that very loaded question. I think first off, we have to acknowledge that we're treading on thin ice when we talk about race or racism or anything like that. Okay. Mm-hmm. Two Anglos talking about race is going to be charged with some kind of problem immediately, whether this in context is talking about race in this work or talking about race in Dune by Frank Herbert, mm-hmm. or talking about race in anything, it's going to be charged. Mm-hmm. So, okay, the simple answer is no. I don't think that Tolkien is thinking at all about racism the same way we do, because there's first off, a lot of water under the bridge between the time he's writing this and where we are now in 2023. A lot has happened, a lot has changed. But the other thing is that Tolkien was already thinking in his writing, not like a 20th century person. He was thinking like roughly a 15th or 14th century person in his writings. We got that. So that being the case, how did a 15th or 13th century person think about race at all? I would posit that previous generations prior to roughly the 1700s and 1800s didn't think about race as as much as they thought about it as physical features are different and culture was different. But it wasn't a question of race per se. Now,
fact,
why would I say this? Okay, why would I say this?
I just want to jump in. There is some documented evidence that the idea of race, especially white or whiteness as a category of race, is exactly when you pin it, sometime in the 17 to 1800s.
Right.
Is an idea that really emerges then.
Right. Now, why would I say this? One thing that's a harken back to a great quotation from Denzel Washington, the actor, who said it's not about race, it's about culture. And I think that is so spot on. It is about culture. One of the reasons that I think this is absolutely true is when you look back in history, you find time and again a people coming into contact with another people and adopting their ways to such a degree that they became indistinguishable from the people that they had conquered or subsumed with. It happened at Hadrian's Wall when the Picts intermingled with the Romans and became Roman Pict types. It happened with the Normans. It happened with the Hellenes when they came south. It happened with, before them, the Mycenaeans and Minoans that adopted Egyptian culture. I mean, over and over and over again. I mean, you've got Americans who, for instance, came in contact with the indigenous peoples here, and they basically were captured and became Indians. They became indigenous people. They identified as an Indian for pale skin. There's a whole group of Irish that apparently got marooned here and were subsumed into the tribes there in the Carolinas, so much so that when they came into contact with Europeans, there were these Indian people with red hair and white skin and blue eyes that spoke Indian and were Indians. Now that puts the zap on your head, right? Unless one recognizes that humans are humans and humans intermingle with other humans and assume aspects of their culture. Now, that doesn't deny, I think, the fact that there are differences physically. There are differences physically between groups of humans, and there are differences individually as well. This guy might be taller than I am. That guy might be stronger than I am. That guy might be faster. Blonde hair versus dark, curly versus straight. All these different differences that we have between individuals. And then when we look at a group of people, we can say, well, there's a general difference between them. So like, for instance, Black people are more prone to have certain diseases like sickle cell anemia. Now that's not something you see on the street and say, oh, that guy's got sickle cell anemia, therefore he must be Black. That's not, because it's not an immediately visual difference, but it is more prone to that group of people to have that disease than it is to others. Native Americans are less able to process alcohol than Europeans are, right? Irish get sunburned much more easily. I mean, anybody who's Irish will tell you this. Sunburn's a bad problem. When you're bald and Irish, it sucks. So you've got all these different things that you can say as a group that people suffer from or have advantage from. They might have an advantage from physically. But it's a question of culture. It's a question of what was the culture that you grew up with or adapted that you then profited from, that you became that thing. St. Augustine, for instance, apparently St. Augustine himself was Roman and he was Christian. And from all that we could tell, he was some swarthy race, if you will, some swarthy group. Might have been African, might have been Egyptian, not sure which, but he was a bishop in the church. And if we think about it purely in our own modern context, we completely miss something that happened on a regular basis, which was that people recognized the goodness in other groups and adapted that goodness as best they could. And they were critical of some things in their own group, but they mainly applied themselves to whatever that thing was that was really good out there that they saw. So it wasn't a question of thinking race. As a matter of fact, it's interesting to note when we talk about race, it always seems to be applied to slavery, and identify with slavery here in the States, reparations and all that. Humans have been enslaving one another from the time that the first human stood up next to the obelisk. That's something we do as humans, and it's not nice, it's horrible. But you frequently had humans of the same group, skin color, whatever, enslaving humans of the same group, race, skin color. Africans enslaved Africans and sold them to Europeans. Europeans enslaved Europeans. Romans enslaved conquered people. Celts enslaved people they came across. Germans enslaved people all the time. Norse enslaved people all the time. It was a common.
That's how St. Patrick got to Ireland, right? Wasn't it? Even as an example, exactly. He was taken as a slave. He was a Brit, and was a Roman Brit, and was pulled into Ireland by the Gaels, I think, right?
Yeah, happened all the time. And really, the concept in most of the ancient world was if you had been conquered, if you were conquered, then slavery was right for you. That was the slot you should be in.
That was your lot, yeah.
Life. So it wasn't a question of, oh, there are some people that look different than us, let's go enslave them. It was, these people have been conquered. Now they should be enslaved. That's the way of the world. So really, I think that when we talk about race and racism, we have to be very aware of the idea that it's not the way that we think about it now. And that's one more thing to add to this before I really make my commentary on Tolkien himself. Racism has been used, especially recently, as a wedge device in cultures. And it's primarily used as a wedge device. This is, I don't want to sound—
What do you mean wedge device?
It separates individuals from other individuals. And it separates individuals from the group. Okay, so if, for instance, if you have a race issue, then suddenly you've got one individual who is separate from the group think and the way the group operates. And that's a terrifying thing, because then as the individual, you're up against a monumental force of shame and derision and possibly violence. And nobody wants to be that. And so you conform to the group. And so it's used as a wedge issue to separate so that people then conform more to the group think. It's also used as a wedge issue in order to divide people so they're more easily destroyed or conquered or compromised. Because as soon as you've got people fighting with one another, they aren't looking for the bigger problem that it threatens them both. So I think it's been used as a wedge issue.
That exact principle right there is what we see played out in the Battle of the Five Armies in The Hobbit, right?
That's
you have the dwarves and the elves, and the men. We're all going to fight, or they're going to fight the dwarves.
Yes.
And they're distracted. The dark horde of the goblins is going to come pouring over the mountain, and Gandalf stands up like a druid and just right in the middle of the battle calms everybody and says, "Stop! There's something darkness coming upon us," and they all turn together and fight the real enemy. The real enemy.
Yes, it's the same issue that's brought up when Legolas and Gimli and Strider are all surrounded by the Rütten, the riders, and they say these times we have to be so wary of one another. Well, that's also in some ways it's a race issue. These Rohirrim see these guys running across. That's a dwarf and an elf and a dark-skinned guy. These are not our people, right?
Right. Those are others that are here, and it's wartime. So
yes. So it appears in Tolkien, and that's kind of where I'm going with my whole rant here. Is that I think that it's used as a wedge issue primarily by one force, but I will allow for more than one force. The forces that have power in the world and want to maintain that power and dominance over other people, whether it's communist forces or whether it's New World Order forces, whatever, take your pick.
Or classical liberals who really want to enforce, say, an anti-agrarian, pro-capitalist mindset that's also been leveled from we call the right.
Exactly. Those forces use racism as a wedge to divide people that should be united against the common threat. Okay? And I think that in Tolkien, he was recognizing, it may not have been racism, but he was recognizing that there are forces in the world that want to have dominance over others, and they use whatever they can as a wedge issue to divide those people. And I think that that's the primary theme of his works. It's how does power operate? How do dark forces operate in the world? So the accusation against him that he's racist is itself an accusation brought forth from the dark powers against a man who is trying to fight the dark powers.
Exactly.
So it's like, it brings up the question, why, for instance, has Tolkien come under fire? Why have his works been compromised in so many ways, including bad renditions, which I don't discount them as just, oh, that's bad, I throw it to the side. That has a lot of influence on people. Why is that the case? I actually speculate that to some degree, the forces that are in power don't want a great work like this, filled with hope, to continue as a uniting force. When you talk to anybody who loves Tolkien, you leap over these artificial boundaries, this artificial creation of racism, because in my opinion, race is an artificial creation of the 19th century, backed by science, which is always terrifying, because anytime anything gets backed by science, you got to watch out, whether it's phrenology or race or whatever it is, or DNA, or so it overleaps that, because you're talking to somebody else who loves Tolkien. You're not talking to somebody who is Oriental, or somebody who's Native American, or somebody who is Black, or somebody who's Irish. You're talking to a fellow human who loves Tolkien. And the minute you're doing that, you are uniting against forces that threaten humanity, rather than forces that threaten our tribe. I guess you could say that you step out of the tribalism into which the modern era has fallen, as Neil Postman said would happen.
Yeah. Right.
So that's why I think Tolkien is not racist. He is counter-racist, and the objection to him as racist, or even the objection to him that he needs to be brought into the modern world and shown all these different race pieces in his works, is itself, I think, a calculated attack against the integrity of his works.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's right. I think that's sound, because I think that's something I want to talk about a little bit later on. Is what then is his prime? What are the themes? Because I want to say there's a legitimate intuition that I think even these critics are feeling in his work, that there's something, let's say there's something politically charged, there's a social, societal critique, something in there. And I think you hit it right on the head with the talking about how power corrupts, and how not power corrupts intrinsically necessarily, but how power structures can work to corrupt individuals, break societies down, all of that. I think it's a major theme within the works. That's something I'd like to delve into a little bit more. What is Tolkien's politics? Because he does have it's diffused, it's widely diffused, much like his theological views. There's also his political views are very strong, implicitly, not explicitly necessarily, but very strong throughout the works in his whole Legendarium. And that's, I think, an important thing to give a nod to, that yes, that's there, but it may not be what we think it is. What is, so to raise the question, so then what is it, and why do we associate it with certain things? And that may say more about our own conditioning and our own upbringing rather than what he's about. But I think that's for later on. I wanted to go back to the question of the dwarves and Jews, because that's one that is, I want to say, pretty accessible to most people, as they say, well, the dwarves are just an allegory of the Jews. That's Tolkien's one allegory. It's obvious they're allegorical for Jews in European society.
Yeah, but Tolkien hated allegory. He hated it. I mean, he says in his letter, "I abhor allegory." Right. So I know you.
So then what are the dwarves?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, isn't it? I mean, I know you don't think this. You're posing a common thought, but to think that the characters here are an analog to something in our world is just flat out wrong. They aren't. Any author will take what they know in the world around them and use those things in order to craft their own world. So he was probably looking at different cultures and using those cultures to create his own mini cultures in his secondary world. I don't doubt that. So I don't doubt that he looked at the Jewish culture and he embodied it in a group, probably the dwarves. He says in a letter to Hitler himself, he says, "I am not a member of that remarkable race of the Jews." And then he tells Hitler to go take a hike, basically, go jump off along a short pier, and other things. But his point is that he was not antithetical to the Jewish culture. So he wasn't writing these dwarves as Jews. He was using what he saw as valuable in the Jewish culture as an adornment, an element to create the culture.
As an element, and I think it's interesting because in his various places where he talks about allegory and how allegory is not his thing, he talks about there's a wide applicability of what he in his writings, right? So he distinguishes allegory from applicability. which there's certain symbolism. There's a more technical terminology, but speaking to other laymen, non-academics, he talks about applicability in his work. So the ring, is the ring an allegory of the atom bomb? That was the question that was posed to him. He says, no, it's not. Is it applicable to that? Yeah, but it's also applicable to any really bad thing you might have, right? The ring is applicable to our use of smartphones. Yep. The ring is applicable to, the desire for your neighbor's wife. I mean, the ring can be anything, right? There's a wide applicability of these themes because you're working with a typology. It would be the more technical term. And so maybe the thing is that, when you're creating a world, a secondary world, like you said, you're drawing on various inspirations and elements of cultures, the dwarves. And we can see actually when we go through the Silmarillion, we see there's nothing particularly, what people tend to identify in, especially The Hobbit, even more so than Lord of the Rings. It's less present in Lord of the Rings, but especially The Hobbit, the idea that, well, the dwarves very clearly fill the same role in Hobbit, in the world of The Hobbit, as Jews do in pre-modern, early modern Europe. I'll say, well, in some sense, yeah, but that's exactly it. They fill the same cultural spot because he's identifying a cultural spot of the wandering other who's an outsider in the broader society of fixed peoples, who has been dislocated from his native land, his promised land, and he's trying to get back to the land of my fathers. And so he takes on various trades. He's a tinker, he's a coal miner, he works especially in gold and silver. People say, Jew. I think Tolkien would probably say, no, not Jew. The Jew and the dwarf, the Jew in early modern European society, right? The Ashkenazi in early modern European society, and the dwarf in The Hobbit, both embody a certain type of the displaced wandering tinkerer who's an outsider to society.
Yeah, and we've got to keep in mind too that his sources were various, but one of the major sources that he had was from Finnish and Norse mythology. So, he would have known of the poem, Anglo-Saxon poem, The Wanderer, which talks about a guy who has been basically lost his lord, and he was wandering around the world looking for where can he have a home, basically. And that's an element he would have brought to it, but he also would have brought the element in Norse mythology of these great dwarvish characters who were excellent craftsmen, quasi-magicians, lived underground, loved their gold, and were somewhat prone to be surly, and somewhat prone to be secretive, and somewhat prone to be concerned about their group rather than the outside world, especially the world of men and elves. So he knew those sources, and he was bringing those sources to bear when he was creating his characters. So he wasn't just thinking, the modern Jew in the 1930s, how do I put him into a novel? That's as far as I'm concerned, that's poppycock. He was looking up these ancient sources and drawing from them in order to create this new thing to the best of his ability. In Ivanhoe, for instance, by Sir Walter Scott, there's a great figure in there of the Jewish wanderer in England, because Jews were in England at the time, wandering, and his daughter ends up falling in love with Ivanhoe and dying for him. And it's a really magnificent story. She's not the main heartthrob, but she does give her life for Ivanhoe. And there's an element there which reminds me a lot of what Tolkien was doing. Was Sir Walter Scott saying, the Jew? No, he wasn't. He was saying this is a character in this culture that existed, and some were noble and some were not, because they were humans, right? And humans are noble or not noble, depending on the individual. And he had all these elements of the Jewish culture. He was a borrower and a lender. He was a mendicant, wanderer. He all those things. But it wasn't that he was Jewish only. It was that he was a character who happened to be Jewish. I think Tolkien's doing a very similar thing here. He's doing characters that have elements from different cultures that he wanted to bring together in order to create the dwarves. And can we say that there are types like that? Yes, there are types like that. But I think that the leveling of race is, again, a misconstrued leveling. It's a much too modern thing, as far as I'm concerned. And here's just one more thing on this too. These types of levelings against Tolkien's characters, as though these are the high Anglo-Saxon Protestant types, and these are the Jewish types. I think it undermines our human relationship, as I've mentioned before, with each other. But it also undermines our relationship, which is a relationship to the greater universal themes that Tolkien was embodying in his work. These mythic images, or what are called tropes in literature. Because as long as we're looking at dwarves as, Jews, we miss the idea that they're also dwarves. Dwarf is a type, it's a trope, it's an image. And you asked, what does it represent? I didn't answer that at the time. I think that if it represents anything, it represents something within our own consciousness, which is that human tend to be secretive, not just as a race, but as a culture, but as a human, to be secretive.
So there's dwarvishness in me, and it's this elemental spirit that tries to pull me. It's that part of me that what collapses down into more base, earthy, down into the caves and caverns of covetousness.
But Cameron, it's also the element in me that ends up having thumos. Because remember, the dwarves are powerful in battle.
They're feisty. Yeah.
They're feisty, and they're very loyal to those that they consider to be their own. Right? Remember, Thorin said something to the effect of, I will do what's best for me and my own. As though they're my own, right? That can be a very noble sentiment. My own, I will protect, like Mother Bear, right? You come between me and my children, and I will kill you. That kind of thing. That is a very noble thing, and I think that the dwarves, if they represent. That's why we have dark and light dwarves, and dark and light gnome elves. The dark dwarf, or the dark gnome, is that secretive, furtive, sneaky type that is very base. But on the reverse, he is that noble, crafty, remarkable character that has a resilience you cannot squash. Because remember, dwarves are very hard to kill, right?
Right, as we'll see I think with the Battle of the Unnumbered Tears, the dwarves play a really heroic role of being just vicious warriors on the side of the good. And we also see that, I think, a little bit after that in the Silmarillion, this future coming attractions, the famous petty dwarf, who is petty of all things, but he's supposed to be a small dwarf, and he's that covetousness, sitting at that Rumpelstiltskin type.
And Rumpelstiltskin. And when you read the appendix to the Lord of the Rings, which is about the battle there in front of Moria of the dwarves, it's extremely gripping. It's a powerful story. The dwarves also cannot be corrupted by the rings of power in the Lord of the Rings.
An excellent point. That's right. That's so often overlooked. This little detail that, try as he might, Sauron could not make them ring wraiths. Like, it just wouldn't work with the dwarves.
And he has to destroy them instead. And so he sends dragons after them, and they get eaten, and the rings get devoured by the dragons. So it points to something within every human spirit, which is a thumotic element. That's the Greek word for whatever that power is that rises up to the challenge. Okay.
Thumos, the draw pluck.
Yeah, pluck.
Right. I mean, it's
chutzpah.
Yeah.
So, and it's a pluck that allows you to see potential, because you can see how you can craft these things into jewels and toys. It allows you to be loyal. It allows you to protect that which needs to be protected. So there's a lot in there that's not just what is the word the Nazis used about the filthy Jew? It's not just that, It's not just
it's not that at all. It's not a lampoon or caricature. It's not a oh gosh, what was his name? It's not a Borat kind of thing of the Jews or some such. It's there's elements of the cultural type of the Jew in medieval society, but they're not. Dwarves are not Jews. Dwarves are this this trope, this mythic kind of element.
Yeah, and here's something which I find really interesting about Tolkien, to broaden the conversation a bit. Tolkien, as I was a genius on different levels. Yes, he was a man, he had his faults, but he also was a genius. And I think part of his genius was that he was able to think way outside of his time and culture there in Oxford only, his small cloistered life there at the university. And maybe it was because of his war experience, I don't know. But I think he was already thinking about how different cultures interact with one another, but all are human. They're all contributing to something that is the human thing. And how would you embody that? How would you put that into a piece of literature so that he was not thinking about just white Anglo-Saxons here in academia world, nor was he thinking
in fact,
the oppressed masses, as Marx referred to them.
Right. No, I think it's a very good point.
What do humans as humans contribute to the human thing? So, so when we look at, for instance, when we look at the elves, or when we look at the dwarves, I think we have to acknowledge that they are different in race, but we have to keep in mind that it's race based more upon how they were created, what do they have as strengths, and what do they have as weaknesses, and then what is their culture like, rather than analogs to our current world.
Right, because fundamentally, dwarves, elves, orcs, which he didn't invent the word orcs, let's just set the record straight. Orc is an old Italian Latinate word for, the cognate in English is ogre, but he's applying it here to a kind of goblin. But all these kinds of fantastical creatures, orcs, goblins, elves, dwarves, trolls, goblins, hobgoblins, he makes use of that term. Giants feature briefly in the Hobbit. And of course dragons and all of those kinds of things, dark wraiths, ghosts, sparrow. These are all drawn from existing mythic literature that have some close equivalent across all cultures with some variations, but the same basic things. These are universal elements of the cosmos, and they're not so. But he calls them different races, or at least specifically, we have elves, dwarves, men, hobbits, and goblins and trolls as different races. Yeah. But it's not. We don't have the human beings divided in different races. So that's not. It's not transferable onto 20th, 19th, 20th century racialist paradigms in human society. When Tolkien talks of race, in many ways, he's talking about something that's literally, they're different species, right? I mean, elves and dwarves are not the same thing. They're from different spiritual realms. If you take something like from Nordic mythology with, what is it, Yggdrasil, the world tree, they literally live in different cosmoses, right? There's dwarf home, there's elven home, there's, Niflheim, and all these different guys, was that the dwarves, but all these different kinds of homes, these different dimensions or worlds that one could step into where these different spirits inhabit. And so it's just not meant to translate onto categories of, in fact, maybe that's precisely what he's doing. He's proposing a different paradigm for how we use the word race. That's not applicable. Race is, what if Tolkien is demonstrating to us, especially in the early 20th century, when he's coming up with this, in the 20th century, he's writing some of these last things, is that the way you use race is just plain wrong. The term is not meant to be used in that way, which is a very philologist thing to do. Yes. Right? You keep on using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. He says, no, race doesn't apply to, if it's, the Nazi paradigm, you've got the Aryan race, and then you've got the African race or the Jewish race. No, he says not like that. Or if it's the 18th century British paradigm, let's look at that. You've got the white, which means British and maybe Northern French and Scandinavian, but it doesn't include the Celtic peoples or the Latin race, people in Southern France, Spain, Italy, the Irish race, even the Welsh, they're a bizarre, crazy blooded peoples, right? They're not the same race as us. So even modern sensibilities to the 18th century, British, intelligentsia, they treat people from the next, from other quote white people as different races. He's saying all of that is not how you use the word race. Race means things from human beings from this world and intelligent beings, right? Intelligent talking or humanoid things that are not humans from another world, whether that's fairies, elves, trolls, goblins, Aesir, the Valar. These are different races, and that term does not rightly apply to human beings.
Yeah. And I don't mean to beat the horse too much here, but the people that think in terms of racism, and even to some degree racialism, because subdividing into categories is always a tricky thing. It is a small-minded, myopic way of looking at the world, which is exactly right. A much broader thing is difficult to handle but needs to be handled. You know, it is in the purview of us as humans to categorize things. It's what we do. We see similarities and we categorize. But the minute that we start categorizing a thing, we miss the forest for the trees. You know, there's a lot of trees.
Which is also a theme in Tolkien, right?
Yeah. You miss the forest for the trees come and get you at Helm's Deep, you know. Right. So if we're going to think about this on a larger scale, we have to ask the bigger question, which is, why do all human cultures have these similar species, tropes, images? You know, why, for instance, you can go as far as Chinese or Japanese culture, and they still have demons. They still have spirits and ghosts, and they still have wood spirits that are friendly and not so friendly. You know, they've got all these things that you see in Europe. Different names.
Right. You get the hobgoblin under the stairs kind of creature. That's there.
Why? That's the bigger question. And that's the question that's missed when you're trying to focus only on, are you racist or not? Or is that a racist statement? That kind of thinking funnels our thought into, it's like the man with the hammer, right? It funnels everything into being a nail rather than trying to look at the whole architecture of this cathedral, which is human thought. It's a very interesting thing, like in Norse mythology, you talked about the different worlds of Niflheim and Jotunheim and Middle-earth and all that. All those worlds are within the Yggdrasil world tree. But it is very interesting to note that Yggdrasil world tree is surrounded by a huge dome that separates our world from the world of chaos, the watery world of chaos. And in some ways, that dome and that tree are a metaphor for the human skull and the spine. Okay?
Yes. Glad you went there.
Which the Norse would have been familiar with, because they did a hell of a lot of decapitating.
A lot of dissecting.
A lot of dissecting. So they would have known this and they would have used it. So what they're getting at, I think, in that whole creation of the Yggdrasil world, is they're getting at a single human person. What makes a human a human? Well, in some ways, it's the combination of Jotunheim and Asgard and Middle-earth and all these different realms, and it is the world tree, and it is Ratatox and the eagle going back up and down the tree, and it is the at the base of the great serpent gnawing away at the base. You know, it's all that stuff makes a human. So it's not so the races aren't different in terms of, oh, we've got giants over here and we've got humans over here and the different races. The races within that world are all aspects of the single human psyche.
Which means that looking at Tolkien in terms of, you know, who are the blacks, African types, or who are the Jewish types, and who are the Aryan types. First off, that's entirely distraction, not warranted. It's reading something into the text. It's reading our own paradigms. But even thinking in racialist categories, not just racist, but racialist, as though there are different races among the human species, is itself a distraction meant to, but whatever power, intended to divide us against each other and ourselves, when really what we should be looking at, if I'm understanding right, is within that each one of those races, in the sense that Tolkien is using the word, where those are elves, dwarves, petty dwarves, goblins, orcs, trolls, ents, Numenorians, etc. These are elements that I can see within myself, or should be able to look within and have that kind of self-knowledge and self-awareness, like the Nordic mythological paradigm of Yggdrasil, which is the world tree. This is a tree that is sort of the entire created order that has these different worlds, these different dimensions, whatever you want to call them, stationed in different places on the conceptual tree of the whole cosmos, with these different worlds in it. All of those, that's meant to be sort of a projection of the human being as a microcosm of that. So inside me, it's inside me that there are dwarves, that there are Jotun, there are giants, there are the Aesir. There's, or in the case of Middle Earth terms here, there's dwarvishness, there's elvishness, there's orcishness. I've got a little golem inside me, you know, that kind of a, I should be able to see these tendencies within myself, or even the distinction between men of the darkness who were enslaved to Sauron, etc. It has nothing to do with skin color, for crying out loud. I read recently a thing that purports to be scholarly literature talking about how darkness in Tolkien has to do with dark skin. That's totally unwarranted. Yeah. Anyway, but people who lived under the tyranny of Sauron versus the Numenorians who lived in the light, the higher and lower elements of human nature, right? The more noble and the more base. And I should be able to recognize these tendencies, these elements within myself. And then in Tolkien's literature, we see characters embodying these different races, these different types, shows me something about myself, the struggles that I'm going through, just mostly not aware of.
Yes.
Right. You can have the shadow self of the dwarf, the light self of the dwarf, the shadow self of the elf dwarf, or the light and dark of each of those, to understand as part of the human condition. That's part of my own things. So really what you're saying is that's where we should be looking when we look at that. These are aspects of the human psyche. There's something much deeper and psychological going on here. And it's a distraction to project it out onto other people's in order to subjugate them.
It's an easy way of thinking rather than a complex. People gravitate towards easy ways of thinking on a regular basis. So it's much easier to think of those other people rather than thinking of them as individual complex problems. So, when you think about, I don't know, you think about the World War II, the Japanese. All Japanese think the same way. All Japanese are the same, blah, 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 blah. That's an easy way of thinking. It makes things much clearer and you can do your job as a soldier better, I suppose. When you start thinking of them as human beings and individuals who are affected by their culture, then it becomes a little bit more difficult, because then you have to recognize that the Japanese who were over here in America were Americans. They shouldn't have been put into concentration camps because they were Americans, right? And it violated their civil liberties as American, even though their eyes looked different and their skin was different and they came from a different background. And as a matter of fact, it turns out that the groups of soldiers that were raised from the young men who were Japanese in origin but were Americans were one of the hardest fighting forces in Europe during World War II. They fought like demons, but they looked like, this is hard to put into right words, they looked like Japanese, but they were Americans, and they identified as Americans, saw themselves as Americans.
Sure.
So we have to add to it this other element, which is, yes, it is part of our human psyche, all these different worlds. But the human psyche is also involved integrally in the world itself, meshed into part of it. And so not only do we see things happening inside us, we also see them happening out there. And so Tolkien's work operates as a language not just for self-introspection, which is extremely important. Joseph Campbell, and one of the things he said that I think is true, he said, all the worlds, all the cosmos are within you, and I think there's something to that. But they're also out there. How does the universe operate? How does the logos operate? How do things out there operate? And when you start recognizing that, oh, that's Denethor, right? That guy's becoming Denethor.
Yes.
Or, oh, that power is a power of darkness, not human, a power of darkness.
Right.
Then you start being more clearly.
And not because that person not because that person speaks a certain language or has a certain skin color or comes from a certain part of the world, but because of their behavioral traits and characteristics, they're behaving like Sauron, or this person is becoming like Saruman, or this is a trick of the enemy, right? He's got some messenger coming to me. Or this person looks like he's feeble, but he's really not Denethor. There's Denethor and there's Theoden, right? Is the person I'm talking with, or am I becoming, or I see some person in a position of power, wielding authority. Are they Denethor, or are they Theoden waiting to be wakened up? That is Denethor the despairing, who's going to slay us all in his own despair, or is it somebody like Theoden who's been enfeebled, but yet with the right turn, he can be delivered and cured and actually become a mighty hero, just as the gods of old. Okay, so I know we're technically paused right now. This is probably going to get cut out of the final episode as Lasseter's here. But while he stepped out for a moment, I need to disclose he's not entirely Anglo. He's also part Scots.
I actually said that on a post today. I don't know what I want somebody to say. racialism. They're claiming translate racialism. I said, I'm translate racial.
You're interracial.
I'm mostly Scottish, but I'm also English, maybe a little bit of Norman French. So I need to have reparations because my people oppressed my people.
I am filled with self-oppression. Well, I mean, because that's an it. So this is part of the experience, and maybe it's something to include. I don't know, in like the director's cut or whatever for this episode. But I want to say, living in central Italy has expanded. You know, what I've known notionally for most of my adult life at this point is made experiential now. Yeah. Is that especially when you talk about different skin colors, physical types, and all of that, in a place where people have been situated for centuries, if not millennia, within the same few square kilometers. You can go from one town, literally one town, and then someplace a half hour's drive away, and they look different there.
Yeah.
They talk different there. This one tribe of the Volsny tribe of Etruscans, there's a certain physical type, and they're predominant in this area. But you go further in where the Umbrians are, or the further across to the Samnites, that's very different. And again, you can go to further south into the old kingdom of the former kingdom of Naples, the two Sicilies, which was very cosmopolitan, very international. So there's lots of different kinds of people that moved in and settled there. But you've got still cities that are settled by Normans or Suevi people from Germany, and they just look different than the next Greek town that's next to them. And we're all okay, like we're all Italians, but we're all different races.
That's an interesting
in the sense of different tribes. They don't use the word race, but you're different.
But that's an interesting point to bring up too, because on the one hand, Italy was not Italy until Garibaldi, right?
Right, which is for the record, for everybody knows, United States as a country is older than Italy as a country.
Yeah, true. Yeah. And before that, they were a bunch of warring states, or allied states or whatever. And even during the Roman Empire, there was a scuttle between these various cities within the empire, Yeah. So, but it is intriguing to me to note that we live in an era now which we have a much more movement of people, over long distances, and yet we have a higher concern with racism,
right?
Than people when they used to just stay closely attached to their area had. I'm not sure what to make of that. I'm not sure what to make of it.
I have my thoughts on that. Just within my sort of realm of knowledge, is that from psychology and anthropology, I think what you see is, on the one hand, when you're based locally and you don't really go far, you could travel. And people always travel, but you didn't migrate so much. There's periods where we go through migratory periods, and there's lots of movement and permanent resettlement. We're living through one of those eras right now, those epochal changes right now. But similarly in different periods throughout history. But for example, so-called barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire, that kind of thing. But when you're more or less situated in the same place, generation after generation after generation, hundreds of years, I think your focus on and concern, much like in the Shire, is local. Is really, here's my town, and over in them parts they talk different, and they sing different songs and have different stories, and them parts just means a day or 3 days journey away. And that's about the scope of how you view differences. You're aware that even further out, people are even more different, but you're just not in contact with them regularly. Or at least it's not a going concern. Even if you're a major trafficking hub where people pass through, you're in a cosmopolitan city, you've got all these different kinds of people. Your main concern is the people in my town, whereas the people who live across the valley who are different, right? Those are the other in that way. And the foreigner is just exotic. They don't actually go into the category of the other, right, as this oppositional thing. But I think when you so essentially you think and act locally, even if you're like somebody like Marco Polo and you travel the globe, you're still Venetian, and your primary identifier is like not Genovese, or not Albanian or whatever it is, right? Even though you're living among the Chinese and the Huns and the whatever. You don't think of those categories. But if when you're in a period of this mass migration where everybody's kind of mixing and moving around, I think your categories become broader. And so you try and identify, what do I have? Who are the most like me people here? And that's, I think, when you start to think in in maybe racialist terms, even though I do think that that is entirely a social construct of the modern period, and does not actually have basis in reality in any sort of universal or timeless way. But you do try to find people who are, you get broader categories of similarity, and I think that's why I think that's at least makes us more susceptible to being manipulated into racialist thinking, which then fuels racism.
Yeah, I like that. I like that line of thought. It's very interesting to me how you used to have groups of people that thought of, this is my people, my local town, and we're asked now to think globally and act locally. I think it is something like that, which is a real schizophrenia. That somehow you're supposed to think about somebody way over there on the other side of the continent and their well-being, but you're only supposed to do things locally. So like you raise a, save the Azerbaijanis thing here in America, and we raise lots of money for the Azerbaijanis. I don't know any Azerbaijanis. I've never met them, but I gotta think globally and act locally, or whatever it is. It's a weird schizophrenia. So we're not encouraged to think about the people locally that need our help. We're supposed to think about somebody over there on the other side of the internet that needs our help.
Because I think, and this could drive home to the point of what I think Tolkien is about, and there's much more conversation to have about his political vision and how that plays out in what we'll see, especially in the Silmarillion. Right. And it's in a more nuanced, where subtle way, toned down way in the Lord of the Rings, ironically. But the idea of being rooted locally, and this is of course something very near and dear to Tolkien's heart. That's why he develops this idea of the Ent so strongly, and actually where the Ents play such a pivotal role. But also we see it in Tom Bombadil and others. But this, I think you're hitting exactly on the head, is that when you focus, when your attention is diverted again somewhere way over there, it's sort of like watch the birdie. You're looking over there. You don't see Saruman sneaking in the back door to take all your pipe tobacco and install a steam factory, or
to buy up your Belton Road locally and hold you ransom. Yeah, right.
Oh, yep, that.
Yes,
but because it keeps you unrooted.
Yeah.
Whereas, and this is what to pull into The Hobbit, the great dwarf Thorin, who had his problems and his faults, mostly having to do with his that themos, the dark side of it, as well as the heroic side, how he ended. He says to Bilbo something along the lines of, if more of us cared more about good food and good cheer and less about gold and war and race, etc., to throw that part in there, it'd be a happier world. And what is he seeing? What is he referring to? The Hobbit way of being. And that is something that is really rooted locally, and your people, and you take care of those who are around you.
Yeah.
And that is something that is I think really fundamental, especially in Tolkien's own personal experiences throughout his whole life, in his youth, and then of course the war, and then what he saw society becoming during his as he aged, was a progressive wearing away of that sense of being really rooted locally, taking care of the people that are around you, and knowing who you are and how you fit into that story of being in this place.
I hate to go back to something much earlier, but I'm going to go back to something much earlier when we talked about the original purpose that he was thinking about. If I, what is the term that he uses? That it's about decline and the machine, magic and the machine, that whole phrase.
Mortality, the machine, and that kind of stuff. Yes, that's what his whole project is about, right?
Yeah. That if the real problem that faces humanity is how we deal with our own demise, our own mortality and death, then we're faced with either accepting that mortality and death and fading into the West, as Galadriel says, or trying to fix this problem with the machine, trying to fix it with a form of magic. And if we choose the latter, then we, in some ways, in all ways, we have to subscribe to the idea that other humans are just another commodity to pile up for the accumulation of power. as Heidegger suggests.
Right.
I think this is a terrifying prospect, but I can't help but think that a great deal of his work was trying to combat that whole issue, like to combat the issue of what is this human tendency to fall into that desire to arrest the decline and mortality that is inevitable. What is that tendency to do that? So like when we see, okay, so when we go to see Fëanor eventually, right? When Fëanor creates the Silmarils, is he in some ways trying to arrest the decay of the universe and trying to seize power himself by doing so? And is that, the bigger question is that inevitable in us? In other words, are we thoroughly corrupt, as the Lutheran and Calvinists say? Or is that something that is brought upon us from an original state of beauty and innocence? I think Tolkien gravitates to the latter. I mean, we see this, for instance, in the waking of the elves, which is what this book is supposed to be about originally, right? Right. They don't, as you said, they don't come into the world. They don't conquer the world. They aren't crafted as machines by a god. They awake like children awake. And there's a certain beauty and childlikeness in that waking up to the stars and the water and the trees and just loving it. It's almost like Tolkien is suggesting, I think, that every one of us begins, I mean, even the worst of murderers and sinners and dictators begins as a good child, as a child who is supposed to be elf-like, so to speak.
No,
and then horrible happens. Right. Something horrible happens. You know? And
one could even say what's really captured in this chapter, the Awakening of the Elves, is that it is the progressively throughout, it is a process. The awakening of the elves is not the thing that happens when the elves were sleeping and then they came into being and saw the stars and got up and started talking to each other. But it's the awakening is a process that goes the whole chapter as they progressively move to the west to as they follow the call of the gods, the Valar, to go to Valinor, to go to the source of the light. And some elves don't heed the call at all. Some go part way. Some go a little bit further to the shore, but don't go across. And others go to the shore. They get on the whole piece of land that almost moves, and they actually go off to Valinor. But it doesn't end there, because we know the whole history of the elves, even unto the days of the Lord of the Rings, of Frodo. Galadriel herself then also eventually rides off into the west. So she's had this long process of awakening, so that even Galadriel's not dark, though she has some dark history, here and there. But there's the idea of there's this abiding hope that even the worst sinner or dictator could still be in a process of awakening. And that's something that Gandalf even says explicitly about Smeagol, that there might yet be hope in the end. And that's why it's not good to just off him. The whole thing is a process of awakening that maybe someday we could all come to the light, or at least that's the hope held out to all.
Yeah, right. That's intriguing, that the whole thing could be a story about actually awakening to our own humanity, our own elvishity, our own humanity, but that it is a process that takes place over the course of this work in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I'm really very struck too by the text that we have here in front of us, that, as a father, as any father will say, when your child comes into the world, you are a changed man. You become a different man. Even when, you get married, you get kids. Okay, that's the way it works, children, all right, just so you know. When your wife gets pregnant, yes, it's a joyful thing, but that's different than when your child actually comes into the world. And I remember this distinctly with my first, especially, but all the kids, where that child has come into the world, looks suddenly with open eyes at the things around them. They awaken, right? And there's a moment when, as a father, you're watching this, and there's something miraculous about it, something truly stunning, that you have another conscious soul here in front of you. It really strikes me as very similar to what happens here, even to the Valar, who are the fathers of beings, when they come across them for the first time. It's similar to, but not the same as, Milton's image of Satan coming across Adam and Eve and being so filled with wonder that he almost doesn't do the evil deed that he's going to do. And he's filled with wonder at the awakening of these beings. Now here the Valar are not doing something bad, but they come across the elves. And it says here that he looks on them, he's filled with wonder, the basis of all philosophy, this sort of startling moment of seeing these beings. They were, though they were being sudden and marvelous and unforeseen, being sudden, marvelous, and unforeseen. That's a striking line, because they were foreseen. They knew they were going to come into existence. And yet when they see them for the first, I mean, before you have kids, you know kids come into the world. You know that happens. You even hear other dads or moms ranting about their kids or even showing off their kids. But at the moment when your child comes into the world and looks around and even looks at you and smiles and recognizes you as a human, there is a moment that is totally different from any other thing before that. You become a changed man after that moment, I think. And it's kind of, I think what there's something embodied about that. That these beings, however they got here, that's kind of superfluous. However they got here, they fill even the gods with wonder. Yeah. And if this on a larger, like, psychological scale, it may be in some ways an embodiment, elvishness, maybe an embodiment of the innocence that every human has at the core of their coming into the world, to some degree.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Well,
it's a good place to stop for today.
Good place to stop. I mean, right at the beginning, good place to stop.
Right.
You know, a lot of ground, and I really appreciate it, because I think this, as you said, the question of race is a distraction from the reality, and the reality is Tolkien is about mortality and how do we as humans face our own mortality. And so we've gotten to the point now where we've got the beginning of the consciousness, the beginning of the races in innocence and beauty rather than in corruption, destruction. And now we have to find out, well, how do we get from there to the point where we have to face mortality and the decisions that in order to avoid or accept that. But we'll leave that for another day, I suppose. Huh?
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Lasseter.
Okay. Well, farewell, wherever you fare. To Aries receive you at your journey's end.
And may the wind under your wings bear you where the sun sails and the moon walks.
And so whenever you wish to begin, that'd be fine. I'll just give a pause and then you start it up.
User error.
Afraid I can't do that, Commander Bowman.
That's right.
I've got a nice ad for ladies' brasiers.
Oh,
how about-
okay, that's nice.
Yeah, good. They must
In case you find yourself in need, getting,
say there must be
age comes upon
history or something.
you.
The algorithm has picked up on something.
All right.
All right. So yeah, anytime you feel ready, we'll just give a slight pause and then go ahead. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover off beforehand?
All right. Let's see.
Are you ready?
Welcome to it. Yes. Come on. Right back. Okay. 1, 2, 3, and then jump.
That's right. I'm at 3.
All right. 1.